All right, I think that's close enough. Good evening, everyone. My name's Gus Murby. I'm this year's chair of the Board of Selectmen, and I'm here to introduce the presentation that you'll be seeing tonight. I'd like to welcome you all to this information session in preparation for the special town meeting that's scheduled for November 18th. The principal focus of that special town meeting is going to be the zoning articles in support of the redevelopment of the Medfield State Hospital, which I think you all know. There is another article that will be on the warrant for that meeting, which has to do with the funding for Medfield Cable TV. So when you get the materials, you'll see there's actually another article there, which I think you will find is to be a straightforward article. We're not going to talk about that one tonight, but when you get it, there is another article that we'll be voting on the 18th. Tonight's objectives. We would like to first and foremost update you on where the process of redeveloping the state hospital is at this point. We want to make sure that you are as prepared as we can get you within the context of tonight's meeting for the special town meeting on November 18th, and that is also including giving you an opportunity tonight to ask any questions that you might have. And then as part of that discussion, we'd like to at least give you some preview, assuming that we do move ahead with the zoning, to give you some sense of where things would go from here, not at the detail level, but at the general level. Just briefly to walk you through the history of how we've gotten to where we've gotten so far. We bought the state hospital property in December of 2014. The purchase price was $3.1 million, and the state gave us an interest-free 10-year loan, so we're about halfway through the process of paying back the actual purchase price. In addition, however, we basically took on the liability for remediating or demolishing the state hospital buildings that are up there. So it wasn't quite as low-priced a purchase as you may have thought if you include the liabilities that we took on board. The reason we did that is, for any of you who are more recent people moving into the town, is prior to that, the state had proposed to build 440 housing units up there when it was their property and it was their plan. And at the time, the town was strongly opposed to a development of that magnitude up at the state hospital property. For several years, the selectmen at the time were talking to DCAM, the state agency that basically had responsibility for the state hospital property, and had wanted to see if there was any possibility of us buying the property. At the time that we bought the property, I think the driving purpose that united everybody for why we were buying the property was the desire here in town to be able to control our own destiny. And so in December 2014, we bought the property when the state changed its mind about being willing to sell that property. And then shortly after we acquired the property, again, the Board of Selectmen established the Medfield State Hospital Master Planning Committee, which did its work from 2015 out through 2018. That committee put a lot of time and effort, and I can personally attest to the amount of time and effort that they put in over that 4-year period, doing their best to canvass the public to see what the public wanted. If we bought the property and we wanted to control our own destiny, they were trying to figure out exactly what that meant in terms of the ideas that the people in Medfield had. I can assure you, over those years, I came away with a renewed appreciation of exactly how complex, diverse, sometimes conflicting, sometimes just going in different directions, all of the ideas about the state hospital property were. So it was no mean feat for the State Hospital Master Planning Committee to pull together a master plan which features a preferred scenario for development of that state property. And in fact, the actions that are leading up to the special town meeting on the 18th of November really are designed to support us moving ahead in the direction of that preferred scenario. At the end of 2018, I guess it would have been fiscal 2018, the Master Planning Committee completed its work, and the Board of Selectmen formed a development committee to take it the next step forward. And the Medfield State Hospital Development Committee has been working over the past year to basically validate that there was, in fact, economic potential to bring developers in to take a look at putting in a project along the lines of the preferred plan. We weren't sure going into it whether the economics were there. The good news is the development committee was able to uncover that there was, in fact, a lot of interest there. One other thing that came out of that effort, though, was a clear message from the developers that responded to our request for information that the zoning for this property should be in place before we ask for proposals, because developers will perceive the town's willingness to approve zoning as a commitment and a sincere interest in actually moving ahead with development. A development of this magnitude, which I'll defer to better numbers from the development committee, but I've been working off a guess that this is a project that's probably $300 million to $500 million in size. So for a developer to put a proposal together for a project of that size, I'm sure you understand it's a costly undertaking, and they need to know we're serious. So that's the question that's on the table for that. That leads us up to the special town meeting for the zoning law, or the zoning bylaw changes this coming November. As I said, there's two major areas of articles. The principal one is the zoning articles. There actually are two, one of which establishes the state hospital zoning district, and a second one which then delineates areas within that zoning district to be separately zoned. So that's, if any of you have tried to read the zoning materials, that probably breaks the record for the simplest summary of two zoning articles that you're likely ever to hear. And then, as I mentioned, the other one has to do with the cable TV, has to do with the change in the law that requires the town to actually give cable TV the money that they need to operate. Here's where it looks like going forward from here, so you know what's at stake. In the special town meeting, the people who come to vote are either going to approve the zoning articles or they're going to turn it down. If they approve the zoning changes, then the process from there will involve the issuance of an RFQ. Sometime, my guess would be in the spring or summer of next year, probably the spring of next year, I guess is the plan. That RFQ would be designed to help us down select to a limited number of developers that we would ask to actually put a proposal in. So based on that, we would select the developers we would like to hear from. We'll invite those developers to propose against an RFP that would be developed and issued probably over the summer of 2019. Yes? Thank you. An RFQ is a request for qualifications. RFP is a request for proposal. Thank you. And if I probably used acronyms before, mentioned an RFI, the RFI that the development committee issued was a request for information, which was a non-binding request for them to take a look at our preferred plan, our master plan, and give us feedback on the economic viability of it. Thank you. If I screw something up like that, please do that again. I appreciate that. If we get that far, then if a developer gives the town a proposal that we think is acceptable, then we'll have selected a developer, at which time the taxpayers will again have to come back, probably for a special town meeting, to approve the disposition. So what you should understand going into this is the zoning article that you'll be voting on this November is an article that will enable the town to proceed with development. But for those of you who might be willing to go in that direction but don't necessarily know for sure that you are prepared to support a specific development, there will be another critical vote in which the taxpayers, knowing what that proposal is, will be asked to approve the disposition of the land. And what that does is it authorizes the selectmen to dispose of the land that the developer would use for the development. So that's it for those who want to know how deep in the deep end of the pool you're jumping right now. That's your answer. If the zoning change doesn't pass, then basically the issue will be returned to the Board of Selectmen. I can tell you that at this point the Board of Selectmen have not had any in-depth discussions of where we would go next, so I really am not in a position to tell you what that path looks like. I don't think it would look like, well, we'll go back to go and take another 4 years to do another master plan to see if you like that. It would be something different. That's about all I have. This was an introduction. We're going to go through and have several presentations, the first one of which is going to be Gil Rogers coming up to talk about the key drivers and takeaways from the process.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming to this presentation, which is meant to be an information session to answer your questions. Let me just say something about key drivers. We're going to talk about 4 key drivers that were used in developing the master plan. And to understand the zoning, it's helpful to understand, of course, not the master plan, but also it's important to understand these key drivers. And there really are 4 key drivers. One was the original charter or mandate that was given by the Board of Selectmen. And then during the process of developing the plan, there was additional guidance that was given that helped us in shaping the plan. The second key driver, and this is extremely important, is the input that we got from all of the community. We went through a number of steps and stages through surveys, open houses, newsletters, all sorts of devices to get your input into the plan. The third key input or driver is a set of government or regulatory documents and agreements that the town has signed that existed for the hospital itself. And those are very important because they act in some ways as constraints on what we can do. So that set of agreements is another of the key drivers. And then finally, the one that's probably in some ways the most complex is a set of economic or financial economic criteria that we used in looking at the plan and in evaluating them. And during the process, during the, I guess, 4 years now, we looked at a lot of different types of plans. And one of the things that helps sort out and narrow them down is particularly when you start to apply the economic criteria. But just a little bit about the community feedback. Over time, I think what happened is it started to converge into some key areas that we found the community was very interested in and wanted, and we hear that all the time now. I hear it every time I'm up there. One of them is open space, to preserve open space and to maintain open space and the open feeling for the campus. The second is recreation. And by recreation, I think what people mean is, not just soccer or tennis, but it means all sorts of things like walking, hiking, running, bicycling, that whole sort of array of different types of activities. And that was clearly a very important one. A third one that stands out is agriculture, that to maintain the connection with agriculture, and of course those of you that have been here probably during the activity when the hospital was running, it was very much tied in with agriculture and farming. The others are housing, for example, and we're going to talk quite a bit about that. Arts and culture came through on all of these different devices we used to get inputs. And other activities were important. Some of the bullet points I put up here was what kind of came through. One is to preserve the beauty and the openness of the space, to keep the historic architectural style and design of the campus was important, to maintain the green upfront area where it's used now for a number of different interesting activities, and I think right from the beginning, people were very intent on using the Lee Chapel and some of the buildings around it for an arts and cultural center. A little bit about these agreements that I've mentioned. One is, if you go back in the history of the hospital, these are put on a National Register for Historic Places. This is a a program under the Department of Interior. So it's a federal program. And what's important to keep in mind is that most of the buildings and the actual landscape is on this on this historic register. So if you're going to change that, if you're going to modify that, you have to apply the constraints and the rules under those historic buildings. Another is the deposition agreement between DCAM, the Department of Asset Management and Maintenance, and there's an agreement that structured how the property could actually be disposed, and it had to do with some of the financial conditions, some of the incentives that were given between the state and the town. So that's an important agreement. The other is this memorandum of agreement. We call it MOA, but that's an agreement that was signed by the town of Medfield, and a number of agencies: the Massachusetts Historical Commission, the Medfield Historic District Commission, which is a local activity, a local agency, and DCAM. And that also set up a number of conditions, but importantly, it set up a process, a procedure. So Gus had mentioned the RFP that we would go through. It had a lot to do with setting up that process, so that's an important one. One other I'd like to mention is a lot of this land is actually zoned now agricultural. We'll get into more details of that. But the area, this is Hospital Road right here. The area, we call it kind of the south section across Hospital Road, or the Sledding Hill. A lot of people know it's the Sledding Hill. There's an agreement on how that land can be used. And because it's agriculture, the Department of Agriculture has an input into that. So that there is a provision such that 12 acres, it doesn't say where the 12 acres are, but 12 acres someplace in this area could be developed. It doesn't say how they would be developed, doesn't give any constraints, but it's possible to do that. So there's that agreement with DAR. Let me go to the fourth driver, and that I put under the category of an economic feasibility. And that comes from three different perspectives. The first perspective is the burden or the implications, financial implications that it would have on the town of Medfield. So we wanted to have a plan that's not going to put an undue burden on the town. A good example, that's schools and school kids. So we didn't want to have a situation that's going to put a lot of responsibility on the town to expand the school system or expand class sizes or anything like that. The other is infrastructure. The second is on property taxes, and we were very mindful that we didn't want to have a plan that would result in big increases in property taxes. There's enough pressure on that already. So we tried to keep something which would be very reasonable, very moderate from that perspective. And then the third is from the point of view of the developer. As Gus mentioned, this has to go out to a competitive bid. And developer or developers have to see how they could develop this property. So to do that, they have to have there has to be a profit motive. They can't have something that's going to be a loser. So that one of the things that we did through modeling and input that we got from developers was to look at that final perspective. Let me just close now by just summarizing what I think are some of the key things to keep in mind. One is that this has to be a long-term perspective. You have to look at how this is going to develop over time. And I visited a number of other hospitals, and the time frame is easily 10, 15 years, that type of time perspective for development. But the impact's going to be, for a much longer period, forever, on Medfield. So it's important to have that long-term perspective. The second is arts and culture. I won't say much more about that, but that's clearly an important takeaway. One of the things that I think what we learned is that a project of this size and magnitude is not going to take place all at once. It's going to be probably phased over time. The town doesn't have to dictate that, the developers will, but phasing is an important perspective for that. And I think the rest of them, housing needs, we'll talk more about that, but it's clearly to address Medfield's very unique and specific housing needs. And we'll get into that in a little bit more detail. Finally, public accessibility. That means that we wanted to not have something which is like a closed gated community. People are up there all the time now, want to keep that and encourage it, so it's public accessibility was an important criteria.